Hi, Allison. Welcome to Potterwatch.
Thanks. Nice to talk to you.
Can you tell the students who you are?
Yes, I'm Allison Anacker. I'm a lecturer in psychological science, and I teach for the Undergraduate Neuroscience program.
Great. And what question have you brought for us today?
Well, I, as a neuroscientist, am interested in the neurological basis of behaviors. And one of the most mysterious and interesting problems that neuroscientists face is, what is a memory? How do we learn things? What forms a memory that you have? And so in thinking about Harry Potter, I was really interested in that aspect of memory, and specifically in what a memory is that you can see in the Pensieve. So when Dumbledore pulls a memory out of his mind, what is that is able to then be seen and watched? How does that memory turn into this stable thing that you can see?
And see, I mean, he says he's externalizing it so he can better understand it, which seems to suggest he's increased his objectivity in some way too.
It's become separate from him.
Yeah. So what is your sort of proposed answer here?
So I'm going to take the neuroscientist reductionist perspective, which is that even really complex abstract ideas like something as big as consciousness or something like a memory can be distilled to some single thing that can explain that, like a cell in your brain. So neuroscientists often are on the search for what that cell or maybe a network of cells is in the brain. And so that's my proposed answer to this question, that there's a network of cells that represents some memory, something that you've learned. And so Dumbledore, through his magic, is able to actually pull out that network of cells that represents that one particular thing that he's trying to remember.
All right. So what do you sort of make of this as a neuroscientist?
It's really hard to explain other than magic. So this is something that is a huge challenge in neuroscience. And some people have been able to identify specific cells that are active in response to a memory. But that doesn't mean that, like, if you take that one cell away, you no longer have that memory. It's definitely something more complex than that. And so it's hard to explain beyond magic at this point. We don't know enough to really have a good idea of what all goes into a memory.
So we see in this Pensieve scene in Goblet of Fire, and then later in the Half-Blood Prince, we return to the Pensieve. And these memories we see can be modified. Slughorn's memory he's modified it himself. But otherwise, do you think we're to understand that these memories are like stable and objective? I mean, they're almost meant to be like documentary videos that Harry's joining.
Right, it does seem that way, but we know that that's not true, that you can modify memories. So when you reactivate a memory, it might make it more susceptible to change. And so you can actually, by learning new things at the same time, you're reactivating an old memory, you're building onto that and changing it. So it's not quite compatible with just being able to watch something like a movie.
So do you think that, like, to a certain extent, this does represent the way that memory works, in the sense that it is, well, you said in the reductionist approach that it represents like a particular point in the brain. What are some other ways in which it doesn't correspond to our understanding of memory?
Let's see. So we couldn't just extract everything as one solid, cohesive piece. It seems that like one aspect of memory. So when I teach this in class, I use an example of my dog who's passed away. And I remember all these little pieces about him. I remember his bark, I remember his fur, I remember his dog smell, everything. And all of those little pieces are also linked to other things that I know. So there's not just one set of cells that's for my dog Parker and nothing else. Those are all linked with many of my other memories. And so you can't just take out one specific event in the case of the Pensieve, or one particular memory of a person or object or something like that alone. So I think that's one way that it's pretty different. Everything in your brain is really connected and tied together.
So Dumbledore conceptualizes the Pensieve as a way for him to better see patterns by like isolating these things. How does the brain actually sort of find patterns between memories?
I think that from a learning perspective, repetition is really important. So reactivating that memory and seeing what it's associated with now. Like I said, you can kind of add new things and new contexts. And so I think that having the ability to continually access that memory and add more to it is what helps you see and make new patterns.
Mm-hmm. So we discussed a little bit in one of my sections whether Dumbledore still has these memories after he's put them in the Pensieve. So what is your take on that? What do you think?
If my proposed solution is correct, that you're actually extracting those cells, then he couldn't have that anymore, because those cells that are responsible for that memory are gone. And that is one of the mysteries to me of this whole story, because do you even remember that you took that out of your mind to analyze it? Where does that memory stop and start? So you have to have a memory that it happened and that you wanted to look at that for a reason. But isn't that just totally ingrained in the memory, with the memory itself? It's very complex.
It also seems, I mean, potentially dangerous to be removing these important memories and storing them in your cabinet.
Where somebody else could happen upon them.
Someone else could. And I think it's interesting, I don't know that the main point of the Pensieve is to be able to share memories with other people, but of course Dumbledore does a lot of that. So how does that sort of, we talk a lot about, subjectivity and objectivity and the degree to which narrators are dependable and reliable. And in the text, these scenes that Harry sees in the Pensieve are really given to us as fact. They're not being mediated through any sort of narrator, besides sort of the textual narrator, which is really different than the way that we tell stories, for example, and share memories with other people. So I'm really interested in what you think about that.
Yeah, it takes it to a whole new level where you're really seeing what somebody else experienced. And, one of the limitations of the human experience is that we can't fully share something that we have experienced, and something like sensory information that comes in. We only know how to communicate about that through our words. We can't actually explain, or we don't have another way of sharing with someone what we've experienced. And so it's the same with memory. You have to pick out certain parts and label them in some way with the words that you choose to be able to share that. And so somebody else's interpretation of that is going to be completely different. So presumably what Harry's seeing in the Pensieve is the true full experience of Dumbledore, which is something that could never happen with our Muggle experience.
Yeah. I mean, it also seems as though he's potentially seeing more than Dumbledore saw, or noticing more than Dumbledore noticed at the moment. It doesn't sort of like, it's not like there's like a blank patch behind where Dumbledore didn't look. It's like he can see. I mean, even going back to, I know this is different, but the Tom Riddle diary, he's sort of walking around Hogwarts with Tom for part of that memory. And it seems as though he could potentially notice things that Tom didn't, or at least didn't realize that he noticed.
Yeah, he's seeing things from his own perspective while watching somebody's memory. So that also brings up an interesting idea in neuroscience, which is that, we're taking in all the time, and we have filters for that. And your attention is your real filter. So what are you choosing to pay attention to, or perhaps you're forced to pay attention to something because it's so loud that it's capturing your attention. And so what you pay attention to is what you ultimately store, learn, and then are able to remember. So that's really important. It's a good study tip for one thing. So being able to apply your own filter and filter out that extra noise. And if you don't mind, I'll take that to another study tip that I have for students, which is trying to manage your stress level appropriately, which is really hard in this particular time period where a lot of us are just overwhelmed with stress. But there's a lot of research looking at how stress and the hormones that are produced in the stress response can affect your learning, and they really have dramatic effects on your learning. So you want to try to manage your stress so that not only is it not too high, which can prevent your learning, but also that it's not too low, because when you're bored, you're not paying attention to what you're supposed to. So you need to have just enough stress where you can direct your attention to the thing and care about it. So that stress level might not be bad stress per se, but just like knowing that you have a deadline coming up, or even just intense interest in a subject. And those things help you direct your attention to what you're supposed to be learning and put you in that optimal zone for the highest level of learning.
It's good. Students, don't let your stress level get too low. Just try to avoid that. Fortunately, we're all here to help.
Yeah, I don't think that there's any risk of that.
Probably not. One of the things that I wanted to ask you, we've talked in one of my sections about, we talk a lot about the magical objects that people never seem to use when we think they should. The time turner needs to make a comeback. Harry, we're always like, look at the Marauders map. And I wonder, are there ways in which you think the Pensieve is underused, that it could be used for things that we don't see it used for in the books?
That is a good question. I mean, I think that actually what we were just talking about is a great example, just being able to share perspective with others. And I think that Dumbledore, you could argue that it's, I don't know what the right word is, not exactly an abuse, but it's an odd use of his power to kind of share this with Harry as just a student. But he could also use that more, and he clearly has a lot of secrets and things that only he knows that might be helpful for other people, especially now as you're getting into the later books, as this like overarching battle grows larger. It would be helpful to bring a lot of people in on the things that he really knows. Then again, he could just use his words for that too.
But I mean, I teach a climate change class, and we've talked about some of the use of virtual reality as a learning tool, and having people really engage empathetically with various sort of scenarios. And as a teacher, he's got this like wealth of 100 years of experience, and that could be a really powerful way to kind of bring students in to some of what he knows, and then for the purposes of education and for empathy. Or on the other end, I guess he could be using it for investigative purposes. You might not need a veritaserum if you can, consensually, hopefully, extract Harry's memory and saw. Seems like
there are rules governing the use of this.
I mean, Dumbledore's a law to himself. He seems to feel that he can do whatever he needs to do.
Yeah, at any time, and not be consistent.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you, Allison, for talking Harry Potter with us today.
I'm happy to do it. Thanks for having me.